Thank you, Jabril. And thank you, President Schenck, for inviting me to deliver this year's Marya McLaughlin Lecture to honor the legacy of an outstanding journalist whose professionalism set a very high standard for us all. These are momentous times in journalism when the standards we hold so dearly are being tested more than ever before, and at a time when our profession itself is needed more than ever to perform its essential mission of keeping society informed during a critical time of increasing conflicts around the world and deep political divisions here in the United States. Ever since I taught my first journalism course in London in 1987, while serving as the Associated Press Bureau Chief, my students have seen 3 large letters on the board as they come into the class for the first time. And it is a practice I continue to follow at the start of every term at the George Washington University. The letters are RAF. And I would tell my students in London, they do not stand for the Royal Air Force, but rather for what I consider the 3 tenets of journalism: responsibility, accuracy, and fairness. And together, they give journalists their credibility. Ours is a unique profession. Unlike the legal profession, where lawyers have to pass a bar exam to be able to practice law, or unlike the medical profession, where doctors have to pass a medical board before they can practice medicine, anyone can be a journalist as long as he or she has credibility. As we have seen recently, even someone with the most distinguished career, who had the largest audience on television for a TV news anchor, can lose that credibility because of a failure to be accurate or a failure to be truthful, and in the process lose the sacred trust of that audience. My use of the phrase RAF has been meant to instill in students the importance of credibility. Now that phrase must be reinstilled in professionals, from those who are cub reporters or interns to the most decorated, award-winning journalists at the top of their careers. Because once anyone loses that credibility, they no longer are fit to continue as journalists. There's no procedure to have them debarred, as happens in the legal profession, or stricken from a list of approved medical practitioners, as happens among doctors. In the case of journalists, without any credibility, they no longer have any standing. Ours is also a unique profession for another very good reason, and it is because journalists also need to follow the 3 very tenets that are at the heart of Marymount University's vision statement of fostering intellectual curiosity, service to others, and having a global perspective. I have tried my best to follow what I call the RAF of journalism and the 3 visionary goals of Marymount University in my life. Excuse me. I like to call myself a lucky kid from Cleveland, Ohio, who got his first dose of journalism at age 11 by working on my junior high school's newspaper, The Short Circuit, and then writing a sports column while in high school for 2 suburban newspapers before going on to study journalism, as Jabril pointed out, at Ohio State University and Columbia University. For those of you here tonight who are in the midst of planning careers, let me encourage you to let your imaginations run as far as your dreams will take you. My dream was to stay in Ohio and work on the Cleveland Plain Dealer or the Cincinnati Enquirer. Instead, I spent my life abroad thanks to a Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship received on graduating from Columbia University that literally changed the course of my life. I was doubly fortunate, firstly, to be able to work for 4 decades as a foreign correspondent and bureau chief for the Associated Press, from Kuala Lumpur to New Delhi to London and Tokyo. And then to have the opportunity at age 65, 10 years ago this year, to start a new career as an educator at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs with a new mission to try to inspire the next generation of journalists and professional communicators. And finally, I'm still humbled by the experience of having been able to serve as the 107th president of the National Press Club last year, and to work to make it a global media center with an emphasis on more programming for international events. It was the culmination of that long journey that began in Cleveland, Ohio. Let me try to share with you some thoughts and memories from that journey that I hope may be beneficial to you, especially the students of Marymount University. Join me as we travel to different parts of the world. Let me take you back to April 15, 2004, when my wife and I attended the annual Sakura, or cherry blossom reception, hosted by Emperor Akihito and Empress Michiko in the gardens of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Normally, guests do not have an opportunity to speak with the Japanese royals, but in this case, the Empress stopped to say hello as she and her husband moved down the receiving line, perhaps because she noticed my wife in an Indian sari in the colors of the cherry blossoms. Wearing the traditional formal morning dress, I said to the Empress that we were honored to spend the last day of our AP life at the Sakura reception. And she replied in perfect English, quote, "Journalists are very important because they perform the important task of informing the world of what is happening in our country and of creating better understanding. I wish you all success for the future," unquote. Creating better understanding. That is the guiding principle we as journalists must always follow in our professional work, be it in print, in broadcasts, in social media, or in any new digital forms being developed. Let me now take you back to what I consider the most challenging assignment of my 4 decades as a foreign correspondent, covering the state of emergency that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's government imposed in India in the middle of the night on June 26, 1975, when she suspended civil liberties, arrested thousands of political opponents, and imposed censorship on the domestic and foreign press. The emergency lasted for 21 months until Mrs. Gandhi's defeat in March 1977. As president of the Foreign Correspondents Association of South Asia, when the emergency began, I was able to get pre-censorship on the foreign correspondence dispatches lifted on the basis that we would ensure our stories were factual. On one occasion, the chief censor, Harry DePena, who was a close friend and had previously been the government's chief information officer before the emergency, called me to his office for a friendly chat over garam chai, or hot tea. He said the government was very worried about the stories emanating from the Associated Press New Delhi Bureau because our stories were distributed around the world, including to neighboring Pakistan, where he said a false story about communal tensions or riots between Hindus and Muslims in India could lead to a major outbreak of violence between the two South Asian neighbors. I replied simply, "Harry, If I write one false story based on rumors or inaccurate facts, the Indian government will expel me, but the Associated Press will fire me. That was the guiding principle of my career, to always ensure accuracy. During my career, I had the very good fortune to report on two religious leaders, close up, you might say, the Reverend Billy Graham and His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. I still vividly recall 5 days spent with the Reverend Graham in November 1972 in Nagaland, in remote northeastern India on the border with Burma. The assignment was literally an answer to any foreign correspondent's prayers, because I was the only American correspondent who covered the Reverend Graham's nightly crusades in Kohima, the capital of Nagaland, starting with the first crusade when I wrote, Billy Graham told the story of Jonah and the whale tonight to thousands of Naga tribals and won fresh converts to Christ. And on the final day, my lead paragraph was, the Reverend Billy Graham ate a cold turkey boxed Thanksgiving lunch today as he flew out of Nagaland on a Russian-built Indian Air Force helicopter at the end of a 5-day visit that celebrated the centenary of the arrival of the first Baptist missionaries in the region. Covering the Reverend Graham's visit to Nagaland was also memorable because of a new title I was given. Although the Reverend Graham traveled with his own entourage of about 6 aides, the local Baptist organizers of the rallies generally only saw the Reverend Graham and me, because I was always at his side with him, reporting on what he said and taking my own photos, which was expected of AP correspondents. After Billy Graham concluded his final sermon, the head of the local Naga Baptists presented a large Naga shawl to Dr. Graham in appreciation of all the time he had spent preaching to the local Naga tribes and traveling a long distance to come to Nagaland. And then he called me up and presented me with a lovely shawl and declared, "May you be a warrior for Christ." I was honored to receive the shawl, although it was appropriately somewhat smaller than the one Dr. Graham received, but it was still lovely. And I was honored to be declared a warrior for Christ, although I was a little worried on 2 counts. First, I had to make an instant ethical decision. Should I accept the shawl as a gift? I decided it was very appropriate to do so, as I would only use it as a personal memento at home, and if you ever visit our residence, you'll be able to view it. Second, I thought for a moment about my mother in Cleveland. I thought about what would my mother in Cleveland think about her son, who had been bar mitzvahed at age 13, being made a warrior for Christ at age 32. And I knew my mother would be fine, because she and my dad always taught us, my brother and me, to be tolerant of all religions and to be respectful of all they do in the name of creating better understanding. My father would know, because he left Russia when he was 12 years old. And that illustrates another guiding principle of my life, to be tolerant and respectful of others and their beliefs. My other experience with a religious leader was with the Dalai Lama in May 1999, when he had tea with the Association of American Correspondents in London, of which I was president at the time. He obviously was enjoying himself as he sat cross-legged on a very proper upholstered chair at the Claridge's Hotel and spoke with us for 90 minutes, an hour more than I was told the Dalai Lama could stay with us. At the end of the session, I said to His Holiness that by sitting next to him, I had the benefit of being able to watch my fellow American correspondents, who normally seem tensed and serious when they met political leaders. But this time, they smiled and did not even have a frown on their faces. At that moment, the Dalai Lama, who had been conversing in perfect English, turned to his translator, whom he had not consulted with during the previous hour and a half, and asked, "What is a frown?" Ladies and gentlemen, the Dalai Lama did not have the word frown in his vocabulary, and that is what I remember most from that audience with him 16 years ago this spring. Let us now travel to Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan in Central Asia on the Caspian Sea, where I spent a week in January 2006 lecturing to news organizations about the importance of maintaining high professional standards in a country noted for its severe press restrictions. It was one of six trips I made to Eastern Europe and Central Asia from 2005 to 2007 to train journalists to make the transition in emerging democracies from being allowed to print only what governments wanted published to what the journalists felt should be published. It is a process still underway. On my last day in Baku, the U.S. Embassy invited a group of about 50 journalists representing government media, other pro-government media, and even those who work for independent media that would on occasion criticize the government, and they were invited to have a group interview with me. Of all the trips to that region, to Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, and Azerbaijan, I received my toughest question in Baku when a young lady stood up and said, "Mr. Belkind, I work for an independent newspaper, and because of articles we have been writing that have been critical of the government, we just learned that private business companies have been told to stop advertising in our newspaper. How are we going to survive?" I was not prepared for that question, but after a few moments, I responded as follows: do as the pamphleteers did in the American Revolution. They published their articles without the benefit of advertising, and instead relied on their readers to support their pamphlets and ensure their survival. If it is not possible in Baku to get the necessary advertising, then concentrate on publishing quality journalism that will attract sufficient number of readers so that your newspaper can survive. It might only survive on cheaply printed paper, but it will have the quality component that will attract readers and hopefully ensure your survival. That is what I said in Baku, Azerbaijan, in 2006. And my views are still as strong as ever on that point. But I need to give you a sad update, and that is to say that according to the annual World Press Freedom Index issued on February 12th of this month by the organization Reporters Without Borders, Azerbaijan is ranked 162 out of 100 nations listed in the index, and Azerbaijan has become Europe's biggest prison for news providers. I hope the young journalists I advised in 2006 to keep up the fight for quality journalism in Baku is safe and well. This lesson from Azerbaijan illustrates another guiding principle I would like to emphasize: the principle of ensuring quality content in all forms of journalism. If the young lady in Azerbaijan was willing to produce quality journalism in the midst of the most difficult of economic and political circumstances and in the face of likely imprisonment, there is no reason why we cannot strive to achieve the best in journalism in a much more developed society with a 200-year-old plus tradition of a free press and a vibrant democracy. At the same time, we must be mindful that our profession does face immense dangers above and beyond economic challenges, real dangers. According to Reporters Without Borders, last year 66 journalists were killed, 119 kidnapped, and 178 in prison, just for carrying out their professional duties as journalists. And let us remember the murder last month of journalists who worked for the French satirical publication Charlie Hebdo. And I know we will never forget the brutal beheadings of journalists by ISIS, of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff of the United States last year, and Kinji Gato of Japan in late January. Nor should we forget Danny Pearl of the Wall Street Journal, who was kidnapped and killed in Pakistan in February 2002 while gathering material for a story on international terrorism. And among those in prison today is James Rezaian, the Washington Post Tehran bureau chief, who has been jailed since last July in Iran without knowledge of charges against him or access to a lawyer. We at the National Press Club are using every opportunity to call attention to his case, and I do so today at Marymount University. And that brings me to a poignant moment in history and a lesson for journalists about the important role they have. Journalists are storytellers, of course, but they also ensure through their reporting that the world becomes aware of unimaginable horrors that are inflicted on society so that no one can say they are just a bystander. At the 70th anniversary commemoration of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp on January 27th, Roman Kent, the survivor who now lives in the United States, made this point when he said, quote, "If I had the power, I would add an 11th commandment to the universally accepted 10 commandments. You should never be a bystander," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, when journalists uncover wrongdoings at whatever scale, they ensure that the world does not ignore or turn the blind eye to what is wrong. Oftentimes, it is only the journalists who are in a position to perform what I call that righteous duty. There also are other dangers confronting our profession through the continuing efforts by governments, including by the Obama administration, to place restrictions on reporters' efforts to gain information so that they can do their jobs. USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page told a White House Correspondents Association seminar in October, according to the Washington Post, that the current White House not only is more restrictive, but also more dangerous to the press than any other in history, and that the current administration is more threatening to press freedom than any administration in American history. The Post, in a compendium of condemnations against the Obama administration's record of media transparency, also said that a notable quotation came from former New York Times executive editor Jill Abramson, who said, "It is the most secretive White House that I've ever been involved in covering." And CBS News' Bob Schieffer said, "This administration exercises more control than George W. Bush's did, and his before that." All this is against the background, according to a report issued by the Committee to Protect Journalists in October 2013, that President Obama came into office pledging open government. The report said that aggressive prosecution of leakers of classified information and broad electronic surveillance program deter government sources from speaking to journalists. Full disclosure, the special CBJ report was written by former Washington Post executive editor Leonard Downey, my classmate at the Ohio State School of Journalism. The Obama administration, in response to Downey's report, said in a statement to Politico that the administration has provided, quote, unprecedented openness in government, unquote. Despite all the challenges facing journalism, let me be clear that I have tremendous optimism about our profession. And it is this optimism that enables me to answer a question I'm frequently asked. Why do I want to devote my professional life after 4 decades abroad with the Associated Press to teaching students the principles of good writing and sound reporting at a time when the job prospects, especially on the print side, are not as bright as they once were, when there are growing dangers to journalists' lives around the world? Firstly, I'm doing so to keep my word to the late George J. Kinzel, who was director of the Ohio State University School of Journalism from 1958 until his untimely death of cancer in 1965, and who was a great mentor to both Len Downey and me. I was fortunate to be a student of his. He inspired me professionally, gave me great latitude to do leading-edge journalism on the Ohio State Lantern, the university's campus daily, and in my senior year, urged me to go to Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and obtain a master's degree so that I could teach the next generation of journalists someday after getting a suitable amount of professional experience, which he thought should be about 5 years. Instead, because of many detours around the world, it took 40 years to keep my word to Professor Kinzel by teaching journalism at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs, and more recently, advanced writing for the Graduate School of Political Management's distance learning program. Secondly, as I outlined in my inaugural address when assuming the presidency of the National Press Club last year, I have great optimism about our profession and its future. I went on to say in my remarks, I'm reminded of a quote by Indian independence leader Mahatma Gandhi, who said in a speech 80 years ago that, quote, in seemingly darkest hours, hope burns bright, unquote. And that is my view of journalism, one of hope and optimism, even in very challenging times. That is why I teach it. That is why I still feel as passionately for the profession as I did when I first worked in my junior high school newspaper in Cleveland, Ohio. We don't know what the world will be like in 100 years, but I'm confident that there will be a craving for information and for news, irrespective of how it is delivered or received. Even among the losses of jobs and media outlets in the last few decades, there still are signs of growth, as there was and continues to be following the establishment of Bloomberg News 34 years ago, as there was with the birth of Politico in 2007, as there has been with BuzzFeed since its founding in 2006 and the expansion of its mission in 2012 to more serious journalism, and indeed that had an exclusive interview with President Obama 2 weeks ago. And the nonprofit Center for Public Integrity, founded in 1989, has proven that investigative journalism is alive and well, as it won a George Polk Award this year for business reporting, following a Pulitzer Prize last year for investigative reporting, an area of journalism that many feared would suffer as a result of staff reductions on newspapers. When I graduated from university in the early 1960s, the goal of many journalists was to own their own newspapers. But that was prohibitive because of the millions of dollars that were needed just to buy a printing press. Now, anyone can be a publisher of news almost for the cost of a laptop or an iPhone. And that is why I tell my students There are immense opportunities in our profession today, provided, with emphasis on the word provided, they maintain the highest professional standards, starting with that most paramount of all standards, accuracy, coupled with responsibility and fairness. By that I mean it is not just enough to put together a story filled with accurate remarks and facts. You must do so responsibly and fairly to ensure that those accurate facts are given in context, that you do not only report facts from one side of an issue, but from all sides, so that your readers and viewers have a complete picture of what you are reporting. In my last year in Tokyo for the Associated Press, I served as president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan and wrote a monthly column for the club's publication, Number One Shimbun, which is the Japanese word for newspaper. One month I devoted my column to what I called a noble profession. In it I wrote in part, one does not go into journalism to get rich monetarily, but the rewards are far greater than anything that money can buy. There is the satisfaction of contributing to better understanding the world, the satisfaction of the occasional scoop, the satisfaction of directing new staffs filled with new members of our profession with the same idealism and thirst for breaking news that I like to feel I still have. A colleague of mine, Brussels correspondent Robert Wheelard, wrote to me to say after reading the column, Myron, I can tell you are retiring as a very rich man. I'm happy to say I have not yet retired. With 10 days to go until my 75th birthday, I'm proud to continue to serve the profession of journalism by teaching, as the late George Kinzel asked me to do when I graduated from Ohio State 54 years ago, and by trying to inspire the next generation of journalists. Tonight, delivering the Marya McLaughlin lecture, I reaffirm to everyone here how fortunate I have been to have devoted my life to journalism, and how I hope these words will inspire those of you in the audience planning to pursue a career in journalism, that you do so with all the enthusiasm and professionalism that you can. We need journalists to follow in the paths of Marya McLaughlin, and I wish to add another CBS journalist and foreign correspondent who died this month, Bob Simon, who distinguished himself as a correspondent for more than 50 years and won numerous awards for his superb reporting from the wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Bosnia. May Bob Simon and Marya McLaughlin always be an inspiration to us all, and may their legacies of responsibility, accuracy, and fairness live on forever. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Jim.
Would the historian likely attribute to the president himself, to his personality, how much to his staff, how much to the Times, the period, dangers. How would the historian look at that?
I think the historian would look at this period and other periods where governments come to power with great promises of more access and do not follow that promise. And I would like to say objectively that despite the obstacles, the journalists got the story out. I'm reminded of interviewing Zulfikar Ali Bhutto when he was an opposition leader in Pakistan in the late 60s. It would have been about 68. And it was a week in which the Pakistani newspapers had celebrated over and over the decade of achievements of Field Marshal President Muhammad Ayub Khan. And Zulfikar Ali Bhutto said to me in the interview, look at the newspapers here. They can only print what Field Marshal Ayub Khan's government wants them to print. It'll be different when I become leader of Pakistan. And it was different. Because when he became prime minister and president of Pakistan, the newspapers didn't have to print accolades about Ayub Khan, but they did have to do so about Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. I think, Jim, historians, I think, a generation from now will study the restrictions placed on the press during the Obama administration. And let me say, restrictions are not limited to Democratic or Republican administrations. They happen consistently, except at this time they've been more highlighted by journalists like Susan Page and Bob Schieffer and others because of the promise that President Obama made. But I hope they will say, despite the difficulties, good journalism prevailed. Yes, please. I'm sorry, what was the last part? Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Well, the new media gives the government, and this will apply, I'm sure, to the next government, the opportunity to bypass traditional media and go directly to the public, as advertisers themselves are doing, cutting back on advertising newspapers, going directly to the public through digital advertising. So in a way, I think there is a plus that the new media provides a medium, an arena, a venue for the public to get news directly from sources. But I am worried, and I've said this before, that the danger with the new media journalism is that it is so fast that more errors are made and credibility is lost. And so I hope the new media will learn the lessons of the importance of credibility. There's also another difference. When I worked at the AP, and my generation worked on newspapers, our copy went through editors that would check our grammar, our style, our spelling, our facts. Now, sadly, as many journalism outlets have cut back on staffs, they have also cut back on editors. And that causes more mistakes that hopefully can be avoided. So speed does not always equate with accuracy, but you got to get it right somehow, and hopefully that will occur. Yes?
I was recently in Australia, and I was reading a newspaper, and there were several words on one page that really were not in my regular vocabulary. So what I'm wondering is, I haven't found that in an American newspaper. I'm wondering to what level of competence or education that you all write to in this country versus possibly other countries.
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought that was interesting. I
Sure.
Your attention and ask your advice about that.
I think what I teach in the intro to news writing and reporting at George Washington University, and other instructors, professors do similar in other media programs, is to write clearly and to try to ensure that you write so clearly that your readers will understand. I don't mean that we need to find a common average. It used to be said, what was the UPI book about? You write for the Kansas City milkman, the average person in the middle of America. I would write the words that are best, and if I feel there is a word or a phrase that people might understand, then to put comma and give a little explanation, comma, and then go on. I hope that answers the question, but it is to be write clearly, and that doesn't mean you have to have the fanciest SAT words. Hope that's not a contradiction, but it's to write clearly. You can have the outstanding vocabulary, but that doesn't mean you're going to write clearly. And I also say to future journalism majors that the skills we teach about journalism, of good writing and sound reporting, will be applicable in other professions. I hate to lose good journalists, but many journalists who have lost jobs have found other opportunities as professional communicators because of the skills of good writing and accuracy and responsibility and fairness. Yes, Eleanor. Well, sure. Sure, I'll try to answer that. Those of us that are old enough still remember the Pentagon Papers that were released by Daniel Ellsberg. There were people that felt that newspapers that won Pulitzer Prize for reporting that shouldn't have. But to go back to a questioner a few minutes ago, nearly 50 years later, I think there's recognition that the newspapers, including the Washington Post and New York Times, that risked jail and prison terms and risked jail and fines, did the right, courageous thing. Each case could be different, but from what I've read, that papers that were given access to the, if you call it the Snowden papers, use discretion. I'll be the first to say that we, as journalists, shouldn't just go out and print whatever we're given. We need to show responsibility. We don't want to endanger lives, but we also don't want to endanger the public's right to know. There is not an easy answer. I'm trying to be as forthright as I can, Eleanor, that journalists have to be responsible. And I know that the likes of the editors of the New York Times and Washington Post today, I heard them on a panel a few weeks ago, are doing their utmost to get the right balance of not risking lives by security disclosures that might just do that, but they need to balance that with the public's right to know. People talk about the lead up to the Iraq War. There is a feeling more than a decade later, and I wasn't involved with that. I was a Tokyo bureau chief for AP. There's a feeling, a strong feeling, that newspapers should have been more aggressive in reporting above and beyond as much as they could, beyond what the government gave them. Bill. Thank you. My full disclosure, he's the executive director of the National Press Club, and we've worked closely together. But Bill is, I'm not trying to justify what you said, Bill is honest. If he didn't like the way I delivered it, he wouldn't say so here, but he would probably tell me so on the ride back to D.C. tonight. But Bill, did you have a question? Sure.
But I noticed tonight that you omitted telling the students and the others here of your service. And I've heard that before. You're slow to mention that.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, how did your military service change the way you looked at journalism? And could you just tell people what it was
Sure.
that you did?
Thank you. I was drafted in 1964 at a time when draftees were not being sent to Vietnam. And I don't know if there's anybody here in Kansas City. If so, I apologize. But after doing basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, I was sent to the Army Hometown News Center in Kansas City, Missouri. And it was a great assignment for a soldier because it was semi-civilian. And we would put out the press releases focused on individual achievements of soldiers for their hometown papers. Except it was boring for me because a lot of it, I felt if we had computers, it could almost been computerized. But happily, the persons in charge of the Army Hometown newspaper gave me the stories to write that required more than the basic facts. But I felt that if I was going to serve, I don't want to say time, but to serve my country as a private first class, that why not do it in Vietnam? And when I applied for a transfer to Vietnam, the commanding officer of the Army Hometown newspaper, I think, thought I was crazy. But I said, no, that's what I want to do. And for a variety of reasons, by the time I got to Vietnam, I did get there for about 3 months and was private first class until I think I left the Army and they promoted me to Spec 4. And I did press work, not political work, just the press work. And when I got there, they said that the journalists who would go to the nightly briefings, they wanted a war communique that they could quote in their dispatches in the style of an AP story. And so I would go to the office, which was in General Westmoreland's headquarters compound, and pull together facts about sorties and facts about various battles and put them together in a wrap-up that would be handed out so the journalists could quote a communique from the Military Assistance Command. I will not give you the slightest inclination, the slightest hint or embellishment that I was in danger. I guess going through Saigon in a rickshaw from the enlisted men's quarters to Westmoreland's compound, there was always a danger of somebody throwing a grenade, but I didn't even think about it. But I'm just proud that at a time when I didn't have to go to Vietnam, I just felt if you're going to serve your country, you do it in the best way that utilizes your talents. And I don't talk about it really because I don't want people to think here's somebody who's talking about being a Vietnam War veteran, which to me implies that you saw battle. I did not see battle. Might have, but it didn't happen in Saigon in my time. But I feel better that when I got discharged from the Army, that I had served those several months in Vietnam. Yes, Jabril?
But you mentioned the importance of being responsible as a journalist to try to deal with crime. And especially like you were talking about getting an age of such great access to information. But I almost think that it's like the apple in the Garden of Eden. Like the knowledge itself is so, the quest, the desire for knowledge itself becomes the sensation and not actually the understanding that comes from the knowledge. And then you also mentioned Charlie Hebdo. that those editors were responsible journalists, active responsible.
I think they fulfilled the mission of a publication that is satirical. Many people do not get the nuance of satire. But I also feel, as I said in answer to the question about Edward Snowden, when editors have to use some discretion, so do editors of satirical magazines. There is a way to highlight the controversy involving a particular religion, but hopefully it's done in a way that people will say there is understanding. That a cartoon, a satirical presentation, as Charlie Hebdo does, is not meant to slander all members of a particular faith. So it is difficult, Jabril, not to answer it, but it's difficult to really deal with those issues. And the editors who have to make those decisions have to do so with great care, experience, and maturity. I read that one of the founders of Charlie Hebdo, who's no longer active, felt they had gone too far. That's his opinion. I would just say one has to be sensitive. And I also will say that journalists make decisions that might not always be right, but at least I hope they make those decisions with care and responsibility. I want to thank you again for the opportunity and honor to speak here, and furthermore, to take your very good questions. Thank you so very much for coming tonight.
Stay up there with me for a minute. Good evening to everyone. For those that I did not get the chance to meet, I'm Matt Shank, the president of the university. So I want to first thank you all for coming out tonight. Special thanks to Mrs. Belkind for giving us Myron this evening and letting him share his story. And I know you've got some great friends and former colleagues here, so I want to welcome all of you to Marymount who have not been to our campus before. And to Myron, let me start by saying happy birthday from all of us. I won't sing, I promise you that, and I won't ask us to sing, but it's an amazing accomplishment. 75 years, and you heard part of the story. What an absolutely amazing life you have led to this point, and I'm sure there's many, many more years and adventures to come, but what a fantastic career. And so on behalf of the entire university family and community, I want to present you with this small token of our thanks. So thank you again. Another round of applause, please, for Myron. And
Thank you so much.
thank you, Myron.